The first time I saw the red Jeep Wrangler rip across my land, I was on my porch at 6:47 in the morning. Coffee cup paused midair. The engine's roar cracked the quiet like a gunshot as the vehicle cut through my southwest pasture right over the survey stakes I'd placed the night before, kicking up a long plume of dust that clung to the early light like a guilty secret. The driver didn't slow down, didn't glance my way, just carved a straight line through my property as if the boundary was nothing more than space. That was the moment my line in the dirt became a line I'd defend. If someone's ever treated your land like their shortcut, you already know what comes next. And if you're wondering how a simple drainage trench became the cleanest, most decisive solution I've ever engineered, you're about to find out. I had been refilling my coffee in the kitchen when the roar cut through the window glass. By the time I reached the porch, the Wrangler was already gone, swallowed by the rise at the far edge of my land. Only the dust remained, drifting lazily across the pasture like it had every right to be there. I stood gripping the doorframe, pulse ticking in my throat, replaying what I had just witnessed. 15 seconds. That was all it took for someone to drive straight through property my grandfather had spent 60 years protecting. I set the cup down harder than I meant to and walked toward the southwest corner. I needed to see the damage up close. The tracks were fresh, deep enough to leave clear tread patterns in the soft earth. But what made my stomach drop wasn't the new marks. It was the older ones beneath them, partially filled by last week's rain, edges softened by time, but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. Someone had been cutting across my land for weeks, maybe longer. This wasn't a wrong turn. This was a habit. I crouched down and pressed my fingers into one of the older grooves, feeling the compressed soil give slightly under the pressure. The pattern told a story I hadn't been paying attention to. Multiple trips, same trajectory, same complete disregard for the fence line 30 feet to the west. I followed the trail to where it crossed onto my property and found what I should have noticed months ago. The bottom rail of my grandfather's fence had rotted through, leaving a gap wide enough to drive a truck through. He had always meant to fix it. I had always meant to fix it. Now that the gap had become an invitation. From there, I could see the back gate of Willowbrook Estates, the subdivision that had swallowed the old Morrison Ranch 8 years back. A quarter mile, maybe less. Straight shot from their rear entrance to the county road on my north side. My land had become someone's personal shortcut, and I had been too busy with work, with grief, with the 1,000 small tasks of keeping a farm running alone, to notice until now. Back at the house, I opened my laptop and pulled up the county assessor's website. 14 years as a civil engineer had taught me to verify before I react. Measure twice, cut once. The same principle applied here. The plat map confirmed what I already knew. My property line ran exactly where my grandfather's survey stakes indicated, exactly where I had placed fresh markers just yesterday. The tracks I had seen were 40 feet inside my boundary. Not close to the line, not ambiguous. 40 feet of deliberate trespass, repeated over weeks, by someone who either didn't know the law or didn't care. I leaned back and stared at the screen, letting the facts settle into place. Then I did something I hadn't done in over a year. I pulled my grandfather's logbook down from the shelf. The leather cover was cracked and soft from decades of handling, and when I opened it, his handwriting filled the pages like a voice from the past. Rainfall totals, fence repairs, crop rotations, disputes with neighbors, documented with dates and outcomes. The man had recorded his life with the same precision I used for load calculations and drainage grades. He would have noticed these tracks the first week they appeared. He would have walked the fence line, found the gap, traced the route back to its source, and he would have handled it. Directly, firmly, the way he handled everything. I flipped to the last entry, dated 3 days before he died. Checked the east fence. Duke needs new shoes. Call Morrison about the water rights. Ordinary concerns. Ordinary days, right up until there were no more days left. I closed the book and set it on my desk. Whatever I decided to do next, I wanted to do it the way he would have. With evidence. With clarity. With the kind of patience that comes from knowing you're standing on solid ground. That night, I walked the property line one more time, flashlight in hand, marking the fence gaps and weak points on a notepad. Duke followed along the inside of his paddock, snorting occasionally as he approved of the inspection. When I finally went inside, the house felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, expectant. It was waiting to see what I would do. I decided to give it time. One confirmed incident wasn't enough to act on, not the way I wanted to act. If the Wrangler came back, I would have a pattern. If it didn't, maybe this was a problem that would solve itself. But even as I made that decision, I knew I was stalling. Someone had carved a path through my inheritance, and every day I let it continue was a day I was teaching them. It was acceptable. My grandfather understood something I was only beginning to grasp. A boundary isn't just a line on a map. It's a statement about who you are and what you're willing to protect. Let someone cross it once without consequence, and you've already told them where you stand. I turned off the lights and lay in the dark, listening to the wind push against the old farmhouse walls. Tomorrow, I will watch. I would wait. And if that red Wrangler appeared again, I would know exactly what I was dealing with. The question wasn't whether I would respond. The question was how long I could afford to stay patient. 10 days passed before I saw the Wrangler again. 10 days of watching, waiting, checking the southwest pasture every morning like a man expecting bad news. When it finally came, I was ready. Saturday morning, 7:15. I was replacing a rotted post along the north fence when the sound hit me. That same engine growl, unmistakable now, rolling across the pasture like a threat. I dropped the post hole digger and turned just in time to see the cherry-red Jeep emerge from behind the tree line, following the same path as before. This time, I saw the driver clearly. A woman, mid-50s, platinum blonde hair catching the morning light, oversized sunglasses hiding half her face. She drove with one hand on the wheel, casual, unhurried, like she was cruising through her own backyard. She never looked in my direction. Not once. The Wrangler carved its familiar route across my pasture, disappeared over the rise, and left me standing there with dirt on my hands and a cold certainty settling in my chest. This wasn't a mistake. This was entitlement. I spent the next hour finishing the fence post, letting my hands work while my mind turned the problem over. Confrontation wasn't my style. Never had been. 14 years of engineering had taught me that the best solutions came from understanding the system, not fighting against it. But understanding required information, and information required contact. That afternoon, I drove to Willowbrook Estates for the first time since the subdivision went up. The entrance featured a stone sign with gold lettering and a small guardhouse that stood empty. Beyond it, rows of identical beige houses lined curving streets with names like Meadow Vista Lane and Sunset Ridge Court. I found the community bulletin board near the clubhouse and scanned the posted notices until I spotted what I was looking for. Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, President Lynette Carrow. The name meant nothing to me then. It would mean everything soon enough. I copied down the contact information and drove home, composing a letter in my head. The letter I sent was polite, measured, exactly the kind of communication my grandfather would have approved of. I explained the property boundaries, referenced the county plat maps, and requested that whoever had been crossing my land please use the public roads instead. I included my phone number and signed it with my full name. Professional. Reasonable? The response came 3 days later, not by mail, but by phone. The voice on the other end was honey-sweet, with an edge underneath, like a knife wrapped in velvet. Mr. Clarke, this is Lynette Carrow, president of the Willowbrook HOA. I received your letter. I told her I appreciated her calling back. She cut me off before I could say anything else. I think there's been a misunderstanding. That path across your property has been used by Willowbrook residents for years, long before you moved in. We've always had an understanding with the previous owner. I felt my jaw tighten. The previous owner was my grandfather. He never mentioned any such arrangement. A pause. Then, cooler now. Well, perhaps that's something you should take up with his memory. Mr. Clarke, the fact remains that this route serves our community, and I don't appreciate being told where I can and cannot drive. I kept my voice level, though it cost me. Mrs. Carrow, I'm not telling you where you can drive. I'm telling you where my property line is. There's no easement registered with the county, no legal right-of-way. What you're describing is trespassing. The line went quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, All the honey had drained from her voice. I see. Well, I suppose we'll have to agree to disagree. Good day, Mr. Clarke. She hung up before I could respond. I sat there holding the phone, staring out the window at the pasture, understanding for the first time exactly what I was dealing with. This wasn't a neighbor who had made an honest mistake. This was someone who believed the rules bent around her convenience. Someone who had decided my land was hers to use, and no piece of paper or property law was going to convince her otherwise. The next 2 weeks confirmed every suspicion. The Wrangler came through daily now, sometimes twice, always following the same route, always driven by the same platinum blonde woman who never once acknowledged my presence. I started keeping count. 7 crossings in the first week, 9 the second. Each one is a small violation. Each one a message. I mentioned the situation to Leo Patterson, my nearest neighbor to the east. Leo was 67, a retired cattle farmer who had lived in this area his entire life. He knew everyone, remembered everything, and had opinions about all of it. When I described the Red Wrangler and its driver, he let out a long whistle. "Lynette Carrow, Lord help you, son." He leaned against his truck and squinted toward Willowbrook. "She's been HOA president over there for going on 12 years now. Runs that place like her personal kingdom. You're not the first person she's steamrolled." He told me about the Hendersons, a young couple who had owned the property adjacent to the subdivision's south entrance. Lynette had decided their fence was an eyesore, demanded they replace it, and when they refused, she made their lives miserable. Code complaints, noise violations, and anonymous reports to the county. They sold the house within a year. "Never saw anyone beat her," Leo said, shaking his head. "She's got the HOA board wrapped around her finger, and she knows how to make things difficult for folks who don't play along." I also met Nora Cassidy that week, a young woman who had moved into Willowbrook 6 months ago. I spotted her at the gas station in town and recognized her from the subdivision's community page. When I mentioned Lynette's name, something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe, or exhaustion. "She's very involved," Nora said carefully, not meeting my eyes. "Very particular about how things are done." She glanced around like she was worried someone might overhear. "I complained once about the HOA fees. Just asked for an itemized breakdown. She sent me 3 emails in one day, explaining why my attitude was detrimental to community harmony." Nora forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I don't complain anymore." That night, I sat on my porch and watched the stars emerge one by one over the pasture. I thought about my grandfather, about the values he had tried to pass down. Stand your ground, but stand it fairly. Don't start fights, but don't run from them either. And always, always keep records. I thought about Lynette Carrow, about the Hendersons who had fled, about Nora Cassidy's nervous glances, and I asked myself a question I had been avoiding. Was this worth it? The easy path was obvious. Let her drive through. Avoid the conflict. Preserve the peace. But what kind of peace required me to surrender my own property? What kind of neighbor demanded compliance instead of compromise? I didn't have an answer yet, but I knew I couldn't keep watching that Red Wrangler tear across my land without doing something about it. Tomorrow, I decided, I would send another letter. Certified mail this time. Official. Documented. And if she ignored that too, well, then I would know for certain that words alone weren't going to solve this problem. I would need something stronger, something she couldn't ignore or dismiss or steamroll past. I just didn't know what that something was yet. The certified letter went out on a Monday. Return receipt requested, signature required, everything by the book. I kept the language formal but direct. This letter serves as an official notice that your continued use of my private property constitutes trespassing under the Texas Property Code. I cited the relevant statutes, referenced the county plat maps, and made clear that any further unauthorized entry would be documented and reported to local law enforcement. I gave her 14 days to acknowledge receipt and confirm compliance. The green card came back 3 days later, with Lynette Carrow's signature scrawled across it like an insult. No response followed. No phone call. No letter. No acknowledgement of any kind. But the Wrangler kept coming. 3 times that week. 4 times the next. She had received my warning and decided it meant nothing. That was the moment I stopped thinking like a neighbor and started thinking like an engineer. If words weren't going to solve this problem, I would need to build something that would. I cleared off my grandfather's old drafting table in the back room and spread out everything I had. The county plat maps, aerial photographs from the assessor's website, my own hand-drawn sketches of the property lines and fence gaps. I stared at the documents for a long time, letting the shapes and distances sink into my mind the way they did when I was designing drainage systems for commercial developments. Every problem has a structure. Every structure has weak points. The key is finding them before they find you. My first task was documentation. If this ever went to court, I would need more than my word against hers. I needed evidence, timestamps, photographs, video footage, a paper trail so thorough that no judge could dismiss it as a he said, she said dispute. I drove to the hunting supply store in town and purchased 2 trail cameras, the kind deer hunters use to monitor game paths. Weatherproof, motion activated, capable of recording date and time on every frame. I mounted one at the southwest corner where the Wrangler entered my property, angled to capture the license plate. The second went near the rotted fence gap, positioned to show the full trajectory of any vehicle crossing through. The cameras were just the beginning. I dug out my grandfather's logbook and studied his format, the way he organized information into neat columns and dated entries. Then I opened a fresh notebook and created my own system. Date, time, description of incident, weather conditions, supporting evidence. Each entry would be a brick in the wall I was building, and I intended to make that wall unassailable. Over the next 3 weeks, the system proved its worth. 17 separate incidents, each one captured on video, each one logged with military precision. I photographed the tire tracks after every crossing, measuring their depth and position relative to the property stakes. I noted the direction of travel, the approximate speed, and the duration of each trespass. The data painted a picture that no reasonable person could deny. This wasn't occasional or accidental. This was systematic, deliberate, and escalating. Lynette Carrow was crossing my land almost daily now, and she was doing it with the confidence of someone who believed she would never face consequences. While the cameras recorded her movements, I buried myself in legal research. Texas property code became my evening reading, dense paragraphs of statute language that I parsed the way I once parsed engineering specifications. I learned about trespass to land, about the elements required to prove a civil claim. I learned about prescriptive easements, the legal doctrine that could grant someone a permanent right-of-way over private property if they used it openly and continuously for 10 years. That one kept me up at night until I did the math. Willowbrook Estates was 8 years old. Lynette had been driving across my land for maybe 2 of those years. Based on the track evidence, she was nowhere close to the 10-year threshold. The law was on my side. I also learned about criminal trespass, a Class B misdemeanor in Texas, if the violator enters private property after receiving notice that entry is forbidden. My certified letter satisfied the notice requirement. Every crossing since then was technically a crime. I wasn't ready to involve law enforcement yet, but it helped to know the option existed. The research gave me options. The documentation gave me leverage, but I still needed a strategy, a way to force Lynette's hand without dragging this into a years-long legal battle. I started mapping out scenarios the way I would map out construction phases. Option 1 was continued documentation, building an ever larger case file until I had enough to pursue civil action. Effective but slow. Legal fees would eat into my savings, and there was no guarantee a court date would come before another year passed. Option 2 was confrontation, blocking the path physically and forcing her to find another route. Faster, but risky. She could claim I was creating a hazard, try to flip the narrative against me. Option 3 was law enforcement. Call the sheriff every time she crossed. Generate enough official reports to establish a pattern of criminal behavior. This had potential, but I knew how these things usually went. Rural deputies had bigger problems than property disputes between neighbors. They would take reports, file paperwork, and nothing would change. I needed something more elegant, something that would solve the problem permanently without requiring me to spend every morning on the phone with dispatch. The answer came to me at 2 in the morning. the way solutions often do when you've been staring at a problem long enough. I was looking at the topographical survey of my property, studying the natural drainage patterns that ran from the high ground near Willowbrook down toward the creek on my eastern border. The southwest corner, where Lynette always crossed, sat in a natural low point. Water collected there after heavy rains, which was why the grass grew thicker in that section. A drainage improvement in that location wouldn't just be plausible, it would be practical, necessary, even. And if that drainage improvement happened to create a physical barrier that vehicles couldn't cross, well, that would simply be a secondary benefit of responsible land management. I sat back and let the idea take shape. A trench, properly engineered, running parallel to the property line, deep enough to catch runoff, wide enough to prevent passage, but shallow enough to avoid triggering permit requirements. In Texas, any excavation under 18 inches on private agricultural land was exempt from county oversight. I could build it myself, document the agricultural purpose, and create a permanent solution that Lynette couldn't argue her way around. For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than frustration. I felt possibility. The trench wouldn't be a trap. It would be exactly what I said. It was a drainage improvement on my own property, serving a legitimate agricultural function. If Lynette chose to ignore posted warnings and drive into it anyway, that would be her decision, not mine. I closed the notebook and stared out the window at the dark pasture. Somewhere out there, buried under 3 weeks of tire tracks and entitled assumptions, was the land my grandfather had entrusted to me. I was done watching it get violated. I was done sending letters that got ignored and making phone calls that went nowhere. It was time to stop asking for respect and start engineering it. Tomorrow, I will begin the detailed design work. Measurements, materials, timeline, everything documented, everything defensible, everything built to last. Lynette Carrow had mistaken my patience for weakness. She was about to learn the difference. The fence came down on a Sunday. I had driven into town for supplies that morning, gone maybe 3 hours at most. When I pulled back up the gravel drive, something felt wrong before I even cut the engine. A stillness in the air, the kind that settles after violence. I walked to the southwest corner expecting to find fresh tire tracks. What I found instead made me stop cold. 12 feet of my grandfather's fence had been dismantled. Not broken, not knocked down by accident. Dismantled. The rails had been pried loose and stacked neatly to one side. The posts left standing like stripped bones. Someone had taken tools to my property and removed a section of fence with deliberate, methodical precision. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the gap, feeling something shift in my chest. This wasn't just trespassing anymore. This was destruction. This was a message. I pulled out my phone and checked the trail camera footage. The timestamp read 11:42 that morning. The video showed a white pickup truck pulling up to the fence line, followed seconds later by the red Wrangler. Lynette Carrow stepped out of the Jeep, while a man I didn't recognize climbed from the truck carrying a pry bar and a cordless drill. They worked together for maybe 15 minutes, removing the rails with casual efficiency while Lynette supervised, hands on her hips, occasionally pointing at something and issuing what looked like instructions. When they finished, she walked to the gap and stood there surveying her work like a general inspecting a conquered position. Then she got back in the Wrangler and drove through, following the same path she always did, disappearing over the rise without a backward glance. The man loaded the tools into his truck and followed. I watched the footage 3 times, letting every detail burn into my memory. The license plates, the faces, the 12 minutes and 37 seconds it took them to erase 60 years of boundary. I called the sheriff's department and requested an officer. Deputy Paul Hartman arrived within the hour, a weathered man in his 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who had seen every kind of neighbor dispute imaginable. I showed him the footage, the stacked fence rails, the tire tracks leading through the gap. He watched the video twice, took notes, and let out a long breath. "That's Lynette Carrow," he said. Not a question. "And Clayton Hurst. He does maintenance work for the HOA. I asked if this was enough to press charges. Hartman rubbed the back of his neck. "Criminal mischief. Technically. Maybe trespass. But she's going to claim this was a legitimate easement dispute. Her lawyer will argue she had a good faith belief that the fence was on community property. I pointed at the survey stakes visible in the corner of the frame. Those stakes mark the exact property line. The fence was 40 feet inside my boundary. Hartman nodded slowly. I believe you, Mr. Clarke, but belief isn't proof in court. She'll tie this up for months if you push criminal charges. My honest advice, document everything, get a lawyer, and pursue this through civil channels. That's where you'll actually get somewhere. He took my statement, photographed the scene, and promised to file a report. I thanked him and watched his cruiser disappear down the county road, knowing that nothing would come of it. Lynette had calculated correctly. The system moved slowly, and she knew how to use that slowness as a weapon. By the time any court date arrived, she would have months more of uncontested access to my land, months more of tire tracks and entitlement, and that smug certainty that rules applied to other people, not to her. I spent the rest of the day rebuilding the fence. New rails, new hardware, stronger than before. The work helped quiet the anger simmering beneath my ribs, gave my hands something to do while my mind processed what had happened. By sunset, the gap was closed. By the following morning, the Wrangler had torn through again, this time swerving around my repairs and cutting a new path 20 feet further into the pasture. She wasn't just ignoring my boundaries now, she was expanding them. 2 weeks later, the irrigation system failed. I discovered it the same way I discovered most of Lynette's damage, by stumbling across the aftermath. The western pasture had flooded overnight, 3 inches of standing water turning the grass into a swamp. I traced the source to a ruptured pipe in the underground irrigation network, a system my grandfather had installed decades ago, and I had maintained religiously ever since. The break occurred exactly where the Wrangler's tracks crossed the buried line. The weight of the vehicle, repeated crossings, had finally cracked the PVC. Water had been hemorrhaging into the soil for hours before I noticed. I shut off the main valve and stood ankle-deep in muddy water, surveying the damage. The pipe itself would cost maybe $200 to replace, but the excavation, the labor, the damaged sod, the water bill from 12 hours of uncontrolled flow, I estimated the total somewhere north of $3,000. $3,000 because a woman I had never wronged decided my property was her personal highway. I called Hartman again. He came out, took more photos, and filed another report. Pattern of behavior, he said, flipping his notebook closed. That helps if you end up in court. I asked if it helped with anything else. He gave me a look that was equal parts sympathy and resignation. Mr. Clarke, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen feuds like this go on for decades. My advice hasn't changed. Get a lawyer, build your case, and find some way to protect your property that doesn't require me to show up every time she pulls something new. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with the repair estimates spread out in front of me. $3,200 in damage, 5 police reports over 2 months, 17 documented trespasses, 2 acts of property destruction, and 0 consequences for the woman responsible. I thought about the Hendersons, the young couple Leo had told me about, how Lynette had ground them down with complaints and violations until they simply gave up and sold. I wondered how many others had walked the same path, how many people had stood exactly where I was standing, staring at the math of confrontation, and decided the cost was too high. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the camera footage one more time. Lynette's face filled the screen, frozen in mid-gesture as she directed Clayton Hurst to pry another rail loose. The confidence in her posture, the absolute certainty that she was untouchable. I had seen that look before, on project managers who cut corners and blamed the engineers when structures failed, on contractors who submitted false invoices and dared anyone to call them out, people who mistook the slowness of consequences for the absence of consequences. They were always surprised when the math finally caught up with them. I closed the phone and reached for my laptop. Attorney Riley Chambers had an office in town, specialized in property law and easement disputes. I had been putting off this call for weeks, hoping the situation would resolve itself, hoping Lynette would come to her senses. That hope was dead now, drowned in 3 inches of irrigation water and 12 feet of dismantled fence. Tomorrow, I will make the call. Tomorrow. I will start building a case that no amount of HOA influence could dismiss, and somewhere in that case, I would find the leverage I needed to make Lynette Carrow understand that my patience had limits. She had mistaken my restraint for surrender. It was time to correct that mistake. Attorney Riley Chambers had an office above the hardware store on Main Street, a narrow space crammed with filing cabinets and law books that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. She was younger than I expected, maybe mid-30s, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a handshake firm enough to mean business. I had brought everything. The camera footage is on a flash drive, the logbook with its 23 documented incidents, copies of the certified letter and return receipt, photographs of the dismantled fence and flooded pasture, repair estimates, police reports, and the county plat maps with my property lines highlighted in yellow. She spread it all across her desk and spent 40 minutes reading without saying a word. When she finally looked up, there was something like admiration in her expression. "Mr. Clarke, I've handled easement disputes for 12 years. I've never seen documentation this thorough." She tapped the logbook with one finger. "This alone would make most judges sit up and pay attention." We spent the next hour discussing strategy. The facts were clear. Lynette had no legal right to cross my property. No easement had ever been filed with the county. No agreement existed between her and my grandfather, and her claim of community usage fell years short of the prescriptive easement threshold. The documented pattern of trespass, combined with the property damage, gave me solid grounds for both civil action and potential criminal referral. Chambers outlined the options with the same methodical precision I used when presenting construction proposals to clients. Option 1 was a civil lawsuit seeking injunctive relief and monetary damages. Strong case, but slow. Filing fees, discovery, depositions, court dates. We were looking at 12 to 18 months minimum before any resolution. Option 2 was pursuing criminal trespass charges through the district attorney's office. The police reports established a pattern, and my certified letter satisfied the notice requirement under Texas law. But criminal cases required the DA's cooperation, and property disputes rarely made it to the top of anyone's priority list. Option 3 was what Chambers called the parallel approach. File the civil suit to establish formal legal proceedings, while simultaneously implementing physical improvements to the property that would prevent further trespass. "The key," she said, leaning forward, "is making sure anything you build is legally unassailable. No booby traps, no hidden hazards, nothing that could be construed as an attempt to cause harm. If she drives onto your property and damages her vehicle on a legitimate agricultural improvement, that's her problem, not yours." I told her about the drainage trench I had been designing. Her eyebrows rose slightly as I explained the specifications. 3 feet wide, 16 inches deep, running parallel to the property line for 120 feet, positioned to capture runoff from the natural drainage pattern that flowed from the Willowbrook high ground toward my eastern creek, lined with gravel for proper water filtration, marked with warning signs at both ends. A functional improvement that served a real agricultural purpose. Chambers pulled out a notepad and started writing. 16 inches keeps you under the permit threshold for excavation on agricultural land. Warning signs establish notice. The drainage function gives you a legitimate purpose. She looked up. "Send me the plans before you break ground. I want to review everything for liability exposure. But on paper, this looks clean." I drove home with a folder full of paperwork and a retainer agreement that would cost me $2,000 to start. Worth every penny if it meant ending this the right way. That evening, I sat down at the drafting table and finalized the trench design. The specifications had been taking shape in my mind for weeks, but now I committed them to paper with the same precision I applied to commercial drainage projects. The location was critical. The trench would run along the inside of my property line, 15 feet from the actual boundary, positioned exactly where Lynette's tire tracks had worn a visible path through the grass. Anyone approaching from Willowbrook would see the excavation clearly. Anyone ignoring the warning signs would have no one to blame but themselves. I calculated the soil displacement, the gravel requirements, and the optimal angle for water flow. 16 inches deep was shallow enough to avoid permits, but deep enough to stop any vehicle that tried to cross at speed. The walls would slope at a 15-degree angle, stable enough to prevent collapse, but steep enough to trap a wheel that dropped in unexpectedly. Saturday morning, I rented a mini excavator from the equipment yard outside town, The rental agreement went into my file along with everything else. Documentation had become a reflex now. Every receipt and timestamp, another brick in the wall I was building. I spent the first hour marking the trench line with stakes and string, measuring twice at every point, checking the alignment against my survey markers. The excavation itself took most of the day. The soil here was clay-heavy, dense, and stubborn, but the little Kubota chewed through it steadily while I guided the bucket along my marked line. By late afternoon, I had a clean trench running 120 feet parallel to the property boundary, 3 feet wide, 16 inches deep, exactly as designed. I climbed out of the excavator and walked the length of my work, checking the dimensions with a measuring tape, photographing every section for the file. The trench looked raw, fresh earth exposed to the air, but it was precisely what I needed, a physical boundary that no amount of entitlement could ignore. Leo Patterson wandered over around 5 o'clock, drawn by the sound of the equipment. He stood at the edge of the excavation with his hands in his pockets, studying the dimensions with the practiced eye of a man who had moved a lot of dirt in his lifetime. "Drainage project?" he asked. Though his tone suggested he already knew the answer, I explained the runoff issues, the natural flow patterns, and the agricultural benefits of proper water management. All true, all documented. All were carefully constructed to withstand legal scrutiny. Leo nodded slowly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Smart," he said. "Real smart." He glanced toward Willowbrook, then back at the trench. "She's not going to like this," I told him, which wasn't really my concern. He laughed, a short bark of genuine amusement. "No, I suppose it isn't. You need a hand with the gravel. We spent the next 2 hours spreading crushed limestone along the trench bottom, creating a drainage bed that would filter runoff and prevent erosion. Leo worked without complaint, hauling wheelbarrow loads while I spread and leveled. By the time we finished, the sun was touching the horizon, and the trench looked almost professional. That night, I installed the warning signs, bright orange, reflective letters, impossible to miss, private property, no trespassing, drainage excavation ahead, one at each end of the trench, one in the middle, all photographed and logged with timestamps. I emailed the photos to Chambers along with the final specifications and a summary of the construction process. Her response came within the hour. "Looks good. Everything appears to be in order. Keep documenting." I stood on the porch and looked out at my work. The trench was invisible in the darkness, but I knew it was there. A line drawn in the earth that said something words had failed to communicate. This is mine. This is where my property begins. Cross it at your own risk. I thought about Lynette, about her certainty that consequences didn't apply to her. She would see the trench soon enough. She would see the signs, and she would have to make a choice. Respect the boundary or ignore it. Either way, the decision would be hers. I had done everything I could to make the situation clear. The next move was up to her. The email arrived on Saturday morning, forwarded by Nora Cassidy with a single line of commentary. "Thought you should see this." I opened the attachment and felt my jaw tighten as I read. The subject line was bold and capitalized. "Urgent safety concern. Dangerous obstruction, created by non-resident." Lynette had sent it to every household in Willowbrook Estates, 63 addresses in total, warning them about the illegal hazard I had constructed near community property. The language was carefully chosen to inflame without technically lying. Reckless excavation, potential liability, threat to community safety. She called for residents to contact the county commissioner's office and demand an investigation. She suggested that my actions might constitute criminal negligence. She closed by reminding everyone that as HOA president, she had a duty to protect Willowbrook from hostile neighbors who refused to cooperate with community standards. I saved the email to my evidence folder and forwarded it to Chambers. Her response was brief. "This could support a defamation claim if you want to pursue it later. For now, keep documenting. Stay calm. Let her make mistakes." Staying calm was easier said than done. I spent the morning checking the trench, verifying that the warning signs were still in place, and photographing everything for the 100th time. The excavation looked exactly as I had designed it. Professional, purposeful, clearly marked. Anyone with eyes could see it wasn't a trap. It was a drainage improvement on private property, and the only way to encounter it was to ignore multiple warnings and trespass across 40 feet of land that didn't belong to you. But Lynette wasn't interested in facts. She was interested in narrative. And right now, she was telling 63 households that I was the villain in this story. I forced myself to step back, to breathe, to remember that emotional reactions were exactly what she wanted. The trench was legal. The signs were visible. My documentation was airtight. If she wanted to escalate to public accusations, she was only adding ammunition to my case. I just had to wait for her to make the next move. The next move came that afternoon. Willowbrook was holding its monthly community garage sale, and half the neighborhood was out on their lawns selling old furniture and children's clothes. I was inside reviewing paperwork when the motion alert pinged on my phone. I opened the camera feed and watched the red Wrangler emerge from behind the tree line, moving fast, heading straight for my property. Lynette was behind the wheel, sunglasses on, jaw set with determination. She wasn't slowing down. I walked to the porch and stood there, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold in real time. The Wrangler crossed onto my land, tires churning through the grass I had just reseeded, barreling toward the trench with the confidence of someone who had made this trip 100 times before. The warning signs were clearly visible, orange reflective letters catching the afternoon sun. She had to see them. She had to know what was coming. But she didn't stop. She didn't even hesitate. The impact was almost beautiful in its inevitability. The Wrangler's front wheels dropped into the trench at maybe 20 miles per hour. Not fast enough to flip the vehicle, but more than enough to bury the axle in 16 inches of gravel and clay. The chassis slammed down, metal grinding against stone, and the rear wheels spun uselessly on the grass. The engine roared as Lynette floored the accelerator. But physics doesn't negotiate. The Jeep lurched forward, maybe 6 inches, then settled deeper into the excavation. I could hear her cursing from 50 yards away. I didn't move from the porch. I didn't need to. The cameras were recording everything. The witnesses were already gathering. From where I stood, I could see half a dozen Willowbrook residents drifting toward the property line, drawn by the sound of the impact. Leo Patterson was among them. Phone already raised, capturing video. Nora Cassidy stood a few feet back, hand over her mouth, watching with wide eyes. Oliver Maddox, a retired contractor I had spoken to once at the hardware store, shook his head slowly as he took in the scene. Lynette climbed out of the Wrangler and slammed the door hard enough to rock the vehicle. Her face was flushed, her platinum hair disheveled, and when she spotted me on the porch, something ugly twisted her features. "You!" She jabbed a finger in my direction, voice rising to a near shriek. "You did this on purpose. This is assault. This is destruction of property." I kept my voice level. "You're standing on my land. Mrs. Carrow, there are 3 warning signs between here and your subdivision. You ignored all of them." She stormed toward me, heels sinking into the soft earth with every step. "This is not your land. This is community access. I have every right to be here." I pulled out my phone and held it up, camera facing her. "This is private property. You're trespassing, and you're being recorded." That stopped her. She stood maybe 20 feet from my porch, chest heaving, visibly struggling to regain control. Behind her, the audience was growing. I counted 9 people now, most of them holding phones, all of them watching Lynette Carrow melt down on land that didn't belong to her. She tried a different approach. She turned to face the gathered residents, spreading her arms in appeal. "You all know me. You know I've dedicated years to protecting this community. This man is trying to cut us off, to deny us access that we've had for years." No one responded. The silence stretched until Oliver Maddox cleared his throat. "Lynette, I've lived here 7 years. I've never once driven across this man's property. None of us has." Leo Patterson lowered his phone, but kept recording. "I told you this would happen, Lynette. I told you years ago when you started this nonsense with the Hendersons. You can't just take what isn't yours and expect people to accept it." Nora Cassidy's voice was quieter, but no less damaging. "You threatened me when I asked questions about the HOA budget. You said you'd make my life difficult if I didn't fall in line. I have the emails." The mask slipped completely then. Lynette's face contorted into something raw and furious. "You ungrateful people. everything I've done for this community. And this is how you repay me, by siding with an outsider. The word hung in the air like a confession. Outsider. As if property lines meant nothing. As if ownership was determined by HOA membership rather than legal deed. I stayed silent and let her keep talking. Every word was another nail in her coffin, another piece of evidence for the record. She ranted for another 2 minutes, accusing the gathered residents of betrayal, threatening vague consequences, and demanding that someone call a tow truck while simultaneously insisting she had done nothing wrong. By the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, she had alienated every witness present. Deputy Nina Merrick stepped out, assessed the scene with one long look, and walked directly to me. "Mr. Clarke, looks like you've had some excitement." I handed her my phone with the camera footage already queued up. She ignored posted warnings and drove onto my property. "The trench is a documented drainage improvement. I have all the permits and specifications." Merrick watched the footage, glanced at the warning signs, then turned to Lynette. "Mrs. Carrow, you're on private property without permission. I'm going to need you to wait by your vehicle while I take statements." The look on Lynette's face as she trudged back to her trapped Wrangler was something I would remember for a long time. The courtroom smelled like old wood and stale coffee, the kind of institutional air that settles into a space after decades of disputes and decisions. I arrived 40 minutes early, wearing the same suit I wore to my grandfather's funeral 3 years ago. Attorney Chambers met me in the hallway, her briefcase heavy with documentation. We had spent the previous week preparing, reviewing every piece of evidence, anticipating every argument Lynette's lawyer might raise. The civil suit had moved faster than expected. Lynette's public meltdown, combined with the police reports and witness statements, had convinced the district court to expedite the hearing. We weren't just seeking damages anymore. We were asking for a permanent injunction and pursuing the criminal trespass charges that Deputy Merrick had filed after the trench incident. Judge Ellen Marwood would be presiding. Chambers had told me she was fair, thorough, and had no patience for theatrics. That sounded promising. Theatrics were all Lynette had left. The courtroom filled slowly. Leo Patterson arrived first, nodding to me from the gallery with the quiet solidarity of a man who understood what was at stake. Nora Cassidy came next, clutching a folder of printed emails, looking nervous but determined. Oliver Maddox settled into a seat near the back, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the skeptical eye of someone who had seen too many neighborhood disputes drag on without resolution. Deputy Merrick was present in uniform, her incident reports ready for submission. Even Deputy Hartman had been called to testify about the earlier complaints. The weight of community attention pressed down on the room like a physical force. This wasn't just my case anymore. It was a reckoning. Lynette entered at 9:55, or 5 minutes before the scheduled start time. She wore a cream-colored blazer and pearls, her platinum hair styled with careful precision, projecting an image of wounded respectability. Her attorney, a silver-haired man named Gerald Vance, walked beside her with the confident stride of someone billing $400 an hour. They took their seats at the defendant's table without looking in my direction. Judge Marwood called the proceedings to order at exactly 10 o'clock. She was a small woman in her 60s with iron-gray hair and glasses that magnified sharp, assessing eyes. She reviewed the case summary aloud, her voice flat and precise. Plaintiff Adrian Clarke versus defendant Lynette Carrow. Claims of trespass, property damage, and harassment. Counterclaim of negligent creation of hazard. Criminal charge of Class B misdemeanor trespass, pending resolution of civil matters. She looked up from her papers. "Counselor Chambers, you may present your case." Chambers stood and walked to the center of the room. She had rehearsed this opening a dozen times, but her delivery felt natural, almost conversational. "Your Honor, this case is about boundaries, not just property lines, though those are central to our claims. It's about the boundary between legitimate community interest and personal entitlement, between disagreement and harassment, between inconvenience and willful destruction." She laid out the timeline with surgical precision, starting from the first documented trespass and building methodically toward the trench incident. The evidence spoke for itself. Chambers introduced the trail camera footage, 27 separate recordings of Lynette's Wrangler crossing my property. She submitted the logbook with its detailed entries, each incident cataloged with timestamps and photographs. She presented the police reports, 5 in total, documenting the escalating pattern of violations. She showed the footage of Lynette and Clayton Hurst dismantling my fence, their faces clearly visible, their actions deliberate and unhurried. She introduced the repair estimates, the irrigation damage assessment, and the receipts for materials and equipment rental. The total damages exceeded $4,800, not counting legal fees. But money wasn't the point. The point was a pattern. 27 documented trespasses over a period of 11 weeks, Chambers said, turning to face the judge. 1 act of vandalism captured on video, thousands of dollars in property damage, multiple police reports, a certified cease and desist letter, signed for and ignored, and finally, a public campaign of defamation designed to pressure my client into abandoning his legal rights. She paused to let the weight of the evidence settle. Mrs. Carrow didn't make a mistake. She made a choice. 27 times. Vance presented the defense with the smooth confidence of a man who knew he was fighting uphill. He argued that Lynette had acted in good faith, believing the path across my property constituted a community easement established through years of informal use. He claimed my drainage trench was an unreasonable hazard, constructed specifically to damage vehicles and endanger drivers. He suggested that I had escalated a simple neighbor dispute into a legal vendetta, wasting court resources over what amounted to a misunderstanding about property lines. Judge Marwood listened without expression, occasionally jotting notes. When Vance finished, she turned to him with raised eyebrows. "Counselor, can you provide any documentation of this alleged easement, a recorded agreement, a surveyor's report, anything filed with the county?" Vance hesitated. "The arrangement was informal, Your Honor, based on community practice rather than written agreement." Marwood's pen tapped against her notepad. "And how many years of continuous use would be required to establish a prescriptive easement under Texas law?" Another hesitation. 10 years, Your Honor. "And how long has Willowbrook Estates existed?" 8 years. The judge nodded slowly. "So even under the most generous interpretation, your client was years away from any legitimate claim to easement rights. Is that correct?" Vance had no answer. The witnesses reinforced what the documents had already established. Deputy Hartman testified to the 5 complaints I had filed. Each one met with Lynette's dismissive claims of misunderstanding. Deputy Merrick described the scene at the trench, Lynette's aggressive behavior, and her refusal to acknowledge the warning signs clearly visible in the photographs. Leo Patterson recounted years of watching Lynette steamroll neighbors who challenged her authority, including the Hendersons, who had sold their property rather than continue fighting. Nora Cassidy's testimony was the most damaging. She produced the emails Lynette had sent her, 3 messages in a single day, threatening social consequences if Nora continued questioning HOA financial decisions. "She told me I was creating a hostile environment," Nora said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "She said she had ways of making things difficult for people who didn't understand how the community worked." Lynette's composure cracked visibly as Nora spoke. I watched her whisper furiously to Vance, gesturing at the witness stand, her carefully constructed image of victimhood crumbling in real time. When Lynette took the stand in her own defense, she lasted exactly 12 minutes before Judge Marwood cut her off. She had been trying to explain why the path across my property was essential for community access, why my fence had been an obstruction, and why her email to residents was simply a concerned citizen alerting neighbors to a safety hazard. Marwood held up a hand. "Mrs. Carrow, let me make sure I understand your position. You believe that your convenience in reaching your home outweighs Mr. Clarke's legal ownership of his property. Is that accurate?" Lynette's mouth opened and closed. "It's not about convenience, Your Honor. It's about community. The community you reference has no legal claim to Mr. Clarke's land. You have no easement, no agreement, no documentation of any kind. You received written notice that your access was unauthorized, and you continued trespassing anyway. You then dismantled Mr. Clarke's fence, damaged his irrigation system through repeated vehicle crossings, and sent defamatory communications to 63 households accusing him of criminal behavior." The judge removed her glasses and fixed Lynette with a stare that could have cut glass. "That is not community, Mrs. Carrow. That is entitlement." The ruling came down the following week. I was in my kitchen when Chambers called, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction I had never heard from her before. Judge Marwood had found in my favor on all counts. Lynette was ordered to pay $4,800 in property damages, plus an additional $2,000 in legal fees. A permanent injunction prohibited her from entering my property under any circumstances. The defamation claim was noted for potential future action if similar behavior continued. The criminal trespass charge resulted in a $500 fine and 6 months of probation. Any violation of the injunction would result in immediate arrest. But the part that mattered most wasn't in the official ruling. It was in the footnote Marwood had added to her decision, a footnote that would become part of the public record, searchable by anyone who cared to look. The defendant's conduct throughout these proceedings demonstrates a troubling pattern of entitlement and disregard for legal boundaries. Her position as HOA president appears to have fostered a belief that community authority supersedes property law. The court strongly encourages the residents of Willowbrook Estates to reconsider whether such leadership serves their collective interests. I thanked Chambers and hung up the phone. Then I walked out to the porch, sat down in my grandfather's old rocking chair, and watched the sun set over the southwest pasture. The trench was still there, a dark line in the earth, doing exactly what it was designed to do. Somewhere in Willowbrook, Lynette Carrow was reading the same ruling, learning that consequences existed after all. I wondered if she understood yet. Probably not. People like her rarely did until the weight finally landed. But that wasn't my problem anymore. My boundaries were intact. The law had spoken. And for the first time in months, the evening felt genuinely quiet. 1 month after the ruling, I stood on my porch at sunrise, coffee cup warm in my hands, watching the mist lift off the eastern pasture. Duke nickered softly from his stall, the same sound he had made every morning for the 12 years he had lived on this land. The same sound my grandfather had heard 1,000 times before me. Everything was quiet. Not the tense quiet of waiting for an engine roar that might come at any moment. Real quiet. The kind that belongs to a place when nothing is wrong. I had forgotten what that felt like. The southwest pasture had healed over the past few weeks. New grass was filling in the tire tracks, softening the scars Lynette had left behind. The irrigation system ran smoothly now, water flowing through repaired pipes to feed the land the way my grandfather had designed it to. The fence stood solid, reinforced with new posts and steel wire that would last another 60 years if properly maintained. The trench remained. Of course, grass had begun creeping along its edges, softening the raw earth into something that looked almost intentional, which it was. News from Willowbrook filtered through in pieces. Leo Patterson kept me updated when he stopped by, which was more often now than before. Lynette had resigned as HOA president 2 weeks after the ruling, citing personal reasons. The board had accepted her resignation without comment. Nora Cassidy had joined the new leadership committee, along with Oliver Maddox and 2 other residents who had grown tired of the old regime. They were conducting an audit of HOA finances, reviewing years of decisions that had gone unquestioned under Lynette's authority. I didn't follow the details. That was their community, their business. My involvement ended at the property line, exactly where it should have. Lynette herself had become a ghost. I saw her car once, driving past on the county road, taking the long way around the way she should have done from the beginning. She didn't look toward my property. I didn't wave. Some silences are better left unbroken. Chambers called one afternoon to ask if I wanted to pursue the defamation claim. The email Lynette had sent to 63 households was still actionable, still sitting in my evidence folder like an unexploded shell. I thought about it for exactly 30 seconds before telling her no. Lynette had lost her position, her reputation, and a significant amount of money. She was on probation, barred from my property, publicly rebuked by a judge who had seen through every excuse she offered. Pursuing defamation would cost more time, more money, and more energy spent on a woman who had already taken too much of all three. There's value in knowing when to stop, I told Chambers. She laughed softly. Most of my clients never learn that lesson. They want to keep fighting until there's nothing left to fight over. I understood the impulse. Part of me wanted to see Lynette ground down to dust, wanted her to feel every ounce of frustration and violation she had inflicted on me. But that part wasn't the one making decisions. My grandfather had taught me better than that. Stand your ground, but stand it fairly. Win clean, and know when you've won enough. I spent that evening in the back room, organizing the documentation that had accumulated over the past 4 months. Police reports, camera footage, legal filings, and repair receipts. A complete record of one woman's entitlement and another man's refusal to accept it. I filed everything in a cardboard box and set it on the shelf next to my grandfather's logbook. 2 records now, side by side, spanning 60 years of protecting this land. His generation's challenges had been different: water rights, fence disputes with cattle ranchers, and his slow encroachment of development on open country. Mine had been a woman in a red Wrangler who believed property lines were suggestions, but the principle was the same. Boundaries matter, not because they keep people out, but because they define what you're willing to protect, what you're willing to stand for when standing costs you something. The last entry in my logbook was dated 3 days after the ruling. Injunction confirmed. Trench holding. No further incidents. I had left space below for future entries, though I hoped there wouldn't be any. The best boundary is the one nobody tries to cross. I closed the book and placed it back in the drawer, next to my grandfather's worn leather volume. 2 generations, same table, same commitment to documenting the truth. Somewhere in Willowbrook. Lights were coming on in kitchen windows as families started their Saturday mornings. Somewhere, Lynette Carrow was waking up to a life with consequences she had never expected to face. And here, on 12 acres of Texas hill country, I was finally able to drink my coffee in peace. Duke called out from his paddock, impatient for breakfast. I rinsed my cup, pulled on my boots, and walked out to feed him. The morning air was cool and sweet, carrying the faint smell of grass and distant rain. My grandfather had stood in this exact spot countless times, performing this exact routine, watching over land that he had poured his life into. Now it was mine to protect. Not through anger or revenge or endless litigation, but through structure, through documentation, through the quiet discipline of maintaining what matters. The trench would stay, the fence would hold, the cameras would keep recording, because vigilance isn't paranoia when experience has taught you its value. But I no longer checked the footage every morning with clenched fists, no longer braced for the sound of an engine violating my peace. That chapter was closed. Lynette had made her choices, and those choices had led her exactly where they deserved to lead. I had made mine, and they had brought me here, to a quiet morning on a piece of land that no one would ever mistake for a shortcut again. I finished feeding Duke and walked the fence line one last time, not because I expected to find anything wrong, but because the ritual felt right. The posts were solid, the wire was tight, the boundary was clear, and for the first time in months, I looked out over my grandfather's legacy and felt nothing but gratitude. This was mine. This was home. And no one was ever going to take that from me without a fight. They couldn't win. Boundaries aren't just lines on a map. They're the promises we make to ourselves about what we'll protect and what we'll stand for. If this story reminded you that patience and structure can defeat entitlement, that doing things the right way still matters, then you understand why I share these stories. Hit subscribe and join the Gated Drama community. We're building something here for people who believe consequences should exist, and justice shouldn't require fists. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time you had to defend what was yours. I'll be reading every single